how this competition unfolds in the Indo-Pacific, because of course I explained that there is a big fight inside the World Trade Organization. Obama came up with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Trump came up with the tariffs, but behind the battle for rules, there are the military muscles, as always. The United States, the Pentagons, and other analysts believe that we are over the era, the time when the U.S. primacy in the Indo-Pacific was uncontested. And this is mostly because the United States has been facing a strategic insolvencies, or a crisis of insolvency. And so the United States is in a situation of overstretch, where its means do not match up with its strategic ends, with its strategic objectives. The reason, as you can imagine, for this this crisis of insolvency are several. One is that a lot of money was spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, of course. The budget during the Obama years, during most of Obama's mandate, was severely cut. But also from a very intellectual, from a strategic point of view, there has been the focus has been on hybrid warfare, on terrorism, to an extent on Russia, and so the United States really forgot, probably like the rest of the West, that interstate competition has never gone away, was always there. But also the United States, especially during the Clinton administration, was very keen on expanding, on developing, on strengthening the global order. And in fact, it was Bill Clinton who was a big advocate of China's entry, adherence to the WTO, to the World Trade Organization. And in fact, until the end of the Clinton administration, the rise of China is completely overlooked. Then there are some discussion in the very early years of the Bush administration, and there seems to be, at the time, a kind of pivot to Asia. But of course, then with the events of 9/11, China is not anymore the priority. So it becomes again a priority between 2011 and 2013, when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton announced the pivot to Asia policy. What the United States think of China in the Indo-Pacific, they think that China will seek a regional hegemony in the near term. I agree. China will pursue that. However, I'm not sure. I think it's still very early to say that China is looking for global preeminence. I think we are very far. Even if China wanted to achieve that, we are still very far from that, from seeing that scenario becoming reality. But certainly China is trying to provide different models of economic engineering, essentially alternative trade agreements that could compete with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that could change the rules of the economic game in Asia-Pacific. What instead China thinks of the US, if you read China's white paper, which is available online in English, and it was published in 2019, China has essentially, in that document, has essentially answered to what the United States brought in its national security strategy. Essentially, China is acknowledging that it's a context between two superpowers, and China acknowledges that there is a strategic competition between the US and China, but they also argue that the rise in their military expenditures, it's mostly due to defensive reasons. And in fairness, their military focus is still at this stage mostly concerning the South China Sea and their domestic, some of their internal regions. Let's have a look at the situation more closely at the relationship, at the competition in the Western Pacific Ocean. A few figures, very briefly. As you know, the South China Sea is a very strategic region. 25% of world trade goes through those waters. There are $5 trillion every year in trade. The U.S. has direct stakes, direct interest in almost 25–30% of those $5 trillion. And there are other important figures. 30% of global oil travel through the South China Sea, and there have been different kinds of assessments, different kinds of evaluations, but there should be roughly 11 billion barrels of oil available under the South China Sea. Probably a little less, probably a little more. And China, in this scenario, clearly enjoys a very privileged position. It oversees the South China Sea. And so China, what it's trying to do is to lower the cost of moving its troops, its naval assets beyond its border. And this is the value of, this is why they're so interested in the 9 dotted lines. And that means that China essentially is seeking to limit the freedom of maneuver of the United States and its allies in the South China Sea, if that should become a necessary thing to do. Okay, so the perception, what the United States believe, and I believe this is a correct assessment, is that China has developed A2AD technologies and ballistic missiles to the point that they could win any short-term conflict within the first chain of islands. The first chain of islands runs from Japan through Japan's Ryukyu Islands down to Taiwan and down to the South China Sea. So the United States believes it's concerned that China might achieve a fait accompli, which is a situation where where for the United States would be too costly to tilt the balance of power. And also it's a situation where the United States and its allies would have to fight to get to the fight with China. So China clearly has a military and geographical advantage within the first chain of islands. Another issue here is that it would take long for other American naval assets to reach the theater of the South China Sea. There have been different assessments here, but analysts believe that it could take between 1 and 2 weeks for ships based in Hawaii to reach the theater. It could take about 3 weeks for the carrier from San Diego, from California, with the whole strike group to reach the South China Sea. So eventually what the United States plans to do here is to adopt a 2-layer strategy, because the United States believe that China's theory of victory, it's based on an idea of a below-the-threshold action. So the idea of achieving a quick victory. So eventually the United States and its ally would try to contain, to slow down Chinese operations, and that would be the resilient layer, while waiting for a surge layer, which means essentially waiting for more assets, for more allies, for more ships to come through the South China Sea and help the United States shift the balance of power. However, we always need to remember about the omelette dilemma. So when you make an omelette, the chicken is involved, because the chicken has to land a few eggs to make the omelette, but the pig has to commit its life in order to provide the ham. Essentially, this is a metaphor that tells that China will fight until the very end for the South China Sea, because it's a matter of survival for China. While for the United States, although the South China Sea is extremely strategic, it's not a matter of survival. So these dynamics clearly matter. The omelette dilemma is not only at the disadvantage of the United States, it can only be at the disadvantage of China. There have been different speculation, different analysis about how China might attack Taiwan, and clearly China would have, if China was to attack Taiwan, China would be the chicken in that situation, and Taiwan would be the pig. Taiwan has, over the last 10 years, has been changing its doctrine. It's a doctrine that doesn't seek anymore to win the Chinese adversary, but it's a doctrine that essentially tries to create a sort of guerrilla warfare at sea in order to impose costs on the Chinese invader. But I mean, we can discuss later to what extent China is really interested in invading Taiwan and taking above the threshold actions in the South China Sea. I'm not so sure that this is in the interest of China at this stage. Instead, there is a